So for those who don't know Megan Schrader, you might have seen a couple of her articles. Megan is on the board of EPC USA, but she also teaches at a program in Texas at the University of Texas, and she can explain probably the program better than I can, or quickly mention more about that. But Megan made a presentation for us at our national conference in Michigan last year, which was excellent. The only downside was she needed more time. She really gets deep into all these issues around disability, the experience of people with disabilities. So I thought we should do another program, give her an opportunity to go deep into these issues. And you'll see that Megan's incredibly well read, incredibly enthusiastic, and strongly concerned about the issue of assisted suicide and euthanasia as it relates to not only people with disabilities, but obviously that's one of her primary issues that she's looking at it from that lens. So Megan has her PowerPoint up here. I'm just going to let her say a little bit more about herself, and then we'll begin.
Hi, I am Megan Schrader. I'm on the board of EPC USA. And as Alex mentioned, I teach at a program called E4 Texas, which is a program for people with intellectual disabilities at the University of Texas. It's a post-secondary program. It's a college environment, but we're also a vocational program. And we teach students to be personal care attendants, child care providers, or teachers assistants. It's incredibly rewarding work. I love it. And as Alex mentioned, I've been involved in this work for several years. I actually, prior to returning to school and getting a degree in special education, I studied musicology for several years and got a degree in that. And when I did that, I studied the use of horror film music to communicate eugenic messages about disabled people, especially as that related to the issue of killing disabled people and as that related to the issue of euthanasia being connected to eugenics more broadly. So I have a lot of interest in that issue and a lot of knowledge about it. It's my privilege to, make this presentation for Alex. I hope it, uh, is helpful to everyone and educational. All right. So the title of this presentation is "How is MAiD, quote unquote, related to systemic ableism, and what can we do instead?" Oh, one thing I should have mentioned at the beginning. Um, I am going to do my best to make sure that this presentation is accessible to people with disabilities. I know that the closed captioning is turned on. I will do my best to describe the visuals on the slides for people who are visually impaired. If for some reason there's an accommodation during this presentation that I didn't provide that somebody needed, please feel free to get in touch with me or Alex, and I will gladly get in touch with you and do everything I can to make the presentation accessible to you. Also, just a visual description. I am a white woman with freckles and red hair. I'm wearing a silver shirt. I have a necklace on. Um, and on this slide, there's a picture of Buzz Lightyear and Woody from Toy Story. And it's just a joke. It's a meme called Ableism, Ableism Everywhere. Okay, so oh good. Okay. All right. Okay. So we're defining MAiD as, for those who don't know, so MAiD, as the proponents call it, is medical assistance in dying. It's the proponents' term for what we opponents call physician assisted suicide. In the US, PAS is limited to people with terminal illnesses, with the oldest law being in Oregon since 1997. In Canada and other countries, MAiD includes people with disabilities. Some US proponents sincerely want to restrict the practice to people with terminal illnesses, and some do not. Unfortunately, legalizing the Oregon model empowers people who want the expansion. And the Oregon model can have deleterious impacts on people with disabilities by normalizing ableist rhetoric or exacerbating problems that people with life-threatening illnesses have when they try to access care. So on the right, there's a picture of tomato, tomato, two tomatoes kind of talking together. You can call it what you want. It's not a good idea. Okay, so since PAS laws in the United States are limited to the terminally ill, I'll mention my experience with terminal illness. I can't understand exactly what the proponents have experienced because I'm not them. But I'm adopted, and in 2016, I suddenly lost my biological mother to lung cancer 2 years after I met her. We had become good friends. She got the diagnosis and she was gone in 2 months. I was already very depressed when that happened, and getting the news caused a psychotic break, and I had to say goodbye to her while I was in that state. That's the experience I draw on to empathize with the proponent's experience of a difficult death or fear of a difficult death. So since psychiatric euthanasia is a thing now, I'll talk about my own experiences with mental illness. I've had treatment resistant depression from bipolar disorder and eating disorders since my mid teens. In addition to the depression, I have a learning impairment from a mild brain injury. Lack of accommodation for the impairment causes environmental triggers for depression. But the psychiatric illness causes the most impairment. That's why I have a picture on the top of the screen of a still from a online cartoon called Hyperbole and a Half. And it's a really great representation of depression. So the psychiatric illness caused the most impairment. At times I have had red wedding level symptoms, which is why I have a picture of the red wedding on the bottom of the screen. So if you don't know about the red wedding, it's a scene in the Game of Thrones where the things seem to be going fine, and then all of a sudden the evil people come in and kill everyone. Sometimes it's just been the psychiatric equivalent of that, and some of my episodes would be a low-hanging fruit for people looking to defend psychiatric euthanasia. So I think we need to talk a little bit about mental illness and autonomy. When you have symptoms of mental illness, autonomy becomes complicated. Some people with symptoms of mental illness are still capable of making free choices, and we should have the chance to do that. But science says that living with persistent mental illness is sort of like being functionally drunk. That's why I have a picture of a video called Psychiatrist Answers Depression and Cognitive Impairment. I really resonate with what the person in the video says, that it's like being drunk. That's what it feels like. Again, mental illness makes autonomy complicated. Catherine Mentler was a woman who sought help for suicidal thoughts in Canada and was offered MAiD. A lot of people with mental illnesses that I know are like that. We sort of know that our thinking is impaired and we're trying to do the best we can. We need and deserve some autonomy, but we are also sort of drunk. I would say that a policy of MAiD for mental illness is abuse. I should mention, sorry, on the last slide, there was a picture of the young woman who went to the emergency room with suicidal thoughts. She's on the right. Okay. So people with mental illnesses may need structured support to fully understand choices and make ones that are consistent with our values. That's why on the right, I have a picture of the 5 steps of supported decision making. It says explore the decision, involve the right people, think about options and consequences, make the decision real, and reflect on what happened. But often that structure and support is not provided. BIPOC individuals with mental illnesses may face additional challenges accessing care and support. People with physical disabilities may face additional challenges accessing care and support. Putting a mentally ill person in a position to be offered MAiD is demoralizing. And offering MAiD to someone suffering from mental illness is abusive. And offers of MAiD to someone with mental illness will exacerbate the oppression that people with mental illnesses face as a group. One other note I wanted to make about mental illness and psychiatric euthanasia. So Udo Schunkling's 2015 paper about why people with treatment-resistant depression should be helped to die by suicide says that people with TRD have 2 selves, a real self and a sick self. And I have to say that's exactly what I and a lot of other people with mental illnesses have experienced while living with our symptoms. What am I doing and where did the real me go? The accurate nature of that insight about the 2 selves is one of the things that makes that essay nihilistic and bullying. Shunkling says that the person's real self is never coming back. But since 2021, I've had a wonderful job where my learning disability is accommodated. I'm helping other people with disabilities and doing things I love. And lately, I felt as though my real self has come back to life. So, shameless plug, if you're looking for a good post secondary program for people with intellectual disabilities, applications for the next session are open until February 1st, and there's a link in the presentation. So I thought I would also discuss my experience with coercion. Now, on the right is an illustration from a 1920s eugenic pamphlet titled Those Who Came After, A Word on Racial Responsibility, showing the yearly cost in pounds, shillings, and pence of educating a normal child compared to a deaf child, compared to a mentally deficient or physically deficient child. That was just the words that they used those terms, physically deficient, back in the eugenics era. And those ideas, those eugenic ideas about special education, are still very prevalent in our culture, I can tell you. When I was in high school, the guidance and special education personnel aggressively tried to stop me from taking college preparatory classes and tests because I was in special ed. There were a lot of legal and structural factors in place that made resisting those efforts difficult and exhausting. Around that same time, a bipartisan legislator lowered special education achievement standards in Massachusetts, where I was living, to save money. It was a lesson in what it's like to have your autonomy undermined by systemic prejudice. One thing I also wanted to mention regarding parallels is that special education holds school personnel to a good faith standard of conduct towards students, just like PAS laws hold doctors to a good faith standard. I can tell you, having fought for myself and others in the special ed system, that's a lousy standard for preventing oppression and abuse. And it's unjust for the proponents to create laws that will put at least some people in a position to be bullied into killing themselves. All right, so I'm just going to go in a little bit about my academic research. So, in the course of my academic research, I found that disability is an essential component of the horror genre. I am not the only scholar to make that connection. On the right is a picture of a book called Hideous Progeny by a scholar named Angela Marie Smith. And then on the left is the book where my essay appears, called Anxiety Muted, American Film Music in a Suburban Age. So revulsion toward disability and disabled people goes back into humankind's earliest history. I studied the use of film music to reinforce eugenic narratives about disability in horror film. In the films I looked at, I found that the film music had a love theme that communicated happiness and able-bodiedness, and the music also had a kind of monster theme that represented the onset of disability and represented the idea that the person had lost some of their humanity. It was not fully human anymore. The love theme would often return in scenes where the disabled monster was killed. So, this idea of killing disabled people being good is so pervasive in society that it's woven into something as innocuous seeming as film music. Okay, I wanted to address the issue: is opposition to assisted suicide religious? Certainly, many religions oppose all forms of killing people, but disability rights opposition to PAS is not religious. PAS is not a practical social policy because it harms disabled people. The conservative Christians oppose it, and so it is good, is not a compelling public policy argument. Now, in the interest of saving our time, I'm not going to read the two pictures. I have pictures of two tweets where people in the disability justice community confront that argument on Twitter that I really resonate with, but I'll skip over reading them because I know we need to conserve our time. So I wanted to just address the issue of compassion and heartbreaking stories. Even though, despite my very obvious, strong opinion against assisted suicide, that doesn't mean I think that everyone who supports it is a bad person. Some people have had traumatic experiences that make their support for assisted suicide understandable. Examples I can think of is a young woman whose terminally ill mom died by suicide that I read about recently, or another young woman who I heard testify at a hearing whose mom died a very painful death from gangrene. And I think a lot of these people just don't understand how PAS might be harmful to others, and I think we can disagree with them while still feeling compassion for them. I think it's important to keep the concepts of able-bodied privilege and structural oppression in mind to understand why PAS isn't a benevolent public policy and shouldn't be legalized based on those painful stories. All right, so this is part 2 of the presentation, which is answering the Right to Die movement's latest canards about disabled people. So, do most people with disabilities support assisted suicide? So on the right, there's a picture of a poll from the Death with Dignity National Center in CNC saying that they say 79% support it. No, this is not true. It's a canard. If you pay for a poll and you ask the right people, you can get any result you want. But since we're looking at polls, I wanted to mention that Scope, which is a UK disability rights group, polled its members and found that the majority opposed PAS. So I have a quote from their writing on that issue. Again, this is a canard from Canada. Death with Dignity Canada often says that the majority of disabled people oppose assisted suicide, even though every disability rights group in Canada took a strong stance against the expansion of assisted suicide to disabled people there. One thing I wanted to mention is that in a 2022 Death with Dignity National Center presentation, um, the Death with Dignity campaigners are encouraged to extend the olive branch to their state disability advocacy organizations and work with them on other disability rights concerns. That's their motivation for becoming interested in disability rights, promoting assisted suicide. This presentation encourages dishonesty to neutralize disability rights opposition to assisted suicide. It actually tells people to consider cloaking themselves and go and spy on the organization. But disability rights groups around the world oppose PAS. On the right, you can see a picture of a man in a wheelchair telling death to fuck off. That's a cartoon made by an artist in the UK. So the opposition to PAS is deeply ingrained in disability justice advocacy. I feel sure if I hired a polling firm and polled my Facebook friends list, which contains multiple leaders in the disability justice movement, the majority would oppose PAS. There have been attempts at hijacking disability rights. You know, Death with Dignity groups have funded AstroTurf disability rights group for years, and then they die. Now there's one made up of a few people called Us for Autonomy. There used to be one named Autonomy Incorporated, and it no longer exists. Death with Dignity people have tried to take over disability rights groups and then they go away. An example is a small group of disability rights supporters chose Catherine Tucker to direct the Disability Rights Legal Center in 2014, and she used it as a platform to push PAS through her End of Life Liberty Project. Now she is gone, and so is her End of Life Liberty Project. And she's done squat on disability rights since she left because Tucker doesn't care about disability rights. She wants to push assisted suicide. Another interloper who I wanted to mention is Christopher Riddle. He's had an unexplained and decorous interest in disabled people since 2010. As you can see from the tweet that is depicted on the left, where he interacts with his colleague Udo Schunklik, Canada, he supports Canada's model of assisted suicide. Reviews of his work rightfully point out that his theories do not cite empirical data from the experiences of disabled people. It's theoretical, not based on disabled people's experiences. Another disturbing thing about his work is that he's asserted that any harm that assisted suicide could cause for disabled people ought not to be of special concern, and he has compared anyone who might be harmed by assisted suicide to a car accident statistic. So he ain't no disability rights advocate, even if he comes to your state to a hearing and says that he is. Here is a picture of all of the disability rights groups that oppose assisted suicide. I wanted to also point out, so there are 12 national disability rights groups opposing assisted suicide, and then there are 5 or 6 local disability groups located within certain states that have said it's okay. But the clear majority is opposed. I'm going to skip over this. There's a peer reviewed research from a colleague called Harold Braswell, asserting that the majority of disability rights bioethicists oppose assisted suicide. That there is a small contingent that support it, but it is, as he says, marginal within the field. Um, there are some outliers, but they don't represent the predominant disability rights view. Um, One thing I wanted to also mention was privilege and assisted suicide in Canada. The disabled Canadian proponents who have brought the Lamb and Truchon lawsuits were upper middle class and privileged. Nicole Glado would have qualified under Canada's reasonably foreseeable death standard, but she fought to be able to do it earlier so that she could die with, quote, a glass of rose champagne in one hand and a canapé of foie gras in the other. And the other person, Julie Lamb, was highly privileged too. And you really need to take that into consideration when you think about this issue. So the small majority of disabled people are sort of like the Gerber baby. The assisted suicide movement uses them to, as tokens to sell their products, sort of like Gerber uses the Gerber baby, but they do not represent the majority of the disabled community. One thing I think it's important to mention, though, is that disabled people have supported eugenics in the past. Helen Keller is one of the most famous and renowned disabled people in history, but unfortunately, she supported eugenics to weed out people with cognitive and emotional disabilities. She even supported infanticide for babies who might grow up to be feeble-minded or criminals, etc. So most of the disabled supporters are following in Keller's footsteps. I'm not accusing them of supporting infanticide, but they are supporting something that is a link to eugenics and that the disabled community largely opposes. One other concept in respect to that I wanted to mention is lateral ableism. Lateral ableism is when a disabled person harbors prejudice against another kind of disabled person, or supports an ableist policy. It's basically, I would say, it's ableist to decide that other disabled people can perhaps be sacrificed so that you can control your own body. Some of the people who have made statements in support of the Oregon model have had their statements used out of context. One example of this is sociologist Tom Shakespeare. He wants to restrict PAS to the terminally ill. And he actually was an expert witness in the Truchon case and urged Canada not to extend assisted suicide to disabled people. And I really admire and respect him for that. But his writings have been cited out of context by expansion supporters to try to refute disability rights arguments. So once you hook up with the assisted suicide movement, you're giving them fuel to achieve an agenda that you may not even agree with. One other thing I did want to mention is a satirical article from the Onion called "Study Shows People with Panic Disorders Respond Poorly to Being Locked in Underwater Elevators." I want to apologize. The last two slides, I didn't describe them like I should have. There was a picture of Helen Keller, and then there was a picture of Tom Shakespeare. I'll do what I can to make sure I describe the pictures from now on. So the picture on the right of people trapped in an elevator screaming is from a story by The Onion. It's a satirical story about a scientific study concluding that people with anxiety disorders don't like being locked in underwater elevators, while loud mechanical voice shouts, "Evacuate now." So disabled people are often put in bad situations by society and by unalleviated symptoms. There are no suicide prevention efforts targeted on disabled people, and therefore I worry that the proponents can probably find lots and lots of disabled people who would like to kill themselves. But a national policy of assisted suicide undermines suicide prevention for disabled people as a group. Okay, so on the left is a picture of just a graphic called "Trying to Undo a Lifetime of Social Conditioning." It's a person thinking through various scenarios that are distressing to them. I must say, maybe you should kill yourself if you need help going to the bathroom is an abusive message to send. But the media sends that message repeatedly. The medical system sends that message repeatedly, and people will naturally internalize that message, and that will make some disabled people think that this assisted suicide is a good idea. But that does not mean that PAS is good for disabled people as a group. Um, Again, I just wanted to reiterate that opposition to PAS is deeply ingrained in disability justice advocacy. So I wrote a thesis on this. I studied it for 9 years, and I found that most disability studies scholars oppose assisted suicide. On the right, there are some pictures of a book called Disability Hate Crimes. There's some pictures of um, academic papers that have been published opposing it. Um, I could give you a list of about 40 different people I know who are big names in the disability justice community who oppose it. In 2011, I was at a Society of Disability Studies annual meeting, and a keynote speaker said that even though he was an agnostic, but he thought that if there was an afterlife, he didn't think that Dr. Kevorkian was enjoying it much, and the entire room of disability study scholars cheered. Um, I'm not going to read all of the quotes that I have from disability study scholars in this presentation because, again, Alex has been asked me to be mindful of time. But this is a really important one from a well-regarded um, scholar named Tobin Sievers. He writes in his book Disability Aesthetics, quote, surprisingly little thought and energy has been given to disrupting the belief that non-quality human beings do exist. This belief is so robust that it supports the most serious and characteristic injustices of our day. Disqualification in this moment in time justifies discrimination, servitude, imprisonment, involuntary institutionalization, euthanasia, human and civil rights violations, military intervention, compulsory sterilization, police actions, assisted suicide, capital punishment, and murder. Um, Again, I know I need to get going, so I'm not gonna go read this entire quote, but I have a slide with a picture of a well-regarded scholar named Adrian Ash, and I have a quote from Recognizing Death When Affirming Life. Can end of life reform uphold a disabled person's interest in continued life? And in there, she discusses disability rights opposition to assisted suicide. Another piece that you might look at for more information about a disability justice perspective is a piece called The Cultural Logic of Euthanasia by bioethicist and English professor Rosemary Garland Thompson. A great analysis of how disability and assisted suicide is represented in the media can be found in a book called Representing Disability in an Ableist World by Beth Haller. Another person that is well regarded who opposed it was a young woman named Stella Young. She was a comedian and public speaker, and she coined the phrase "inspiration porn" during her TED talk entitled "I'm Not Your Inspiration. Thank you very much." She was an opponent. Alice Wong is a very well regarded disability and racial justice advocate, and she an author, and she opposes it as well. Disabled opponents of assisted suicide are not a vocal minority, as the proponents contend. So now we move on to assisted suicide and privileged conceptions of autonomy. Okay, so one thing I wanted to know is that for some, apparently autonomy only goes so far. In October of 2023, Thaddeus Mason Pope tweeted that places will eventually legalize involuntary euthanasia. He writes, agree. Obviously, many jurisdictions will later authorize involuntary euthanasia, but today we need valid consent. He did not say that this was a bad thing. It's reasonable to want to prevent the legalization of any euthanasia to prevent the building of the scaffolding for involuntary euthanasia, and it's very odd to center one's entire mission around autonomy and then be willing to violate other people's autonomy in such a drastic way. But basically, physician-assisted suicide is a desire of the privileged. Again, I'm going to try to move on, but there's a quote from a New York Times article from 2012 acknowledging that the people supporting assisted suicide are overwhelmingly white, well-educated, and financially comfortable. Now, PAS might work out fine if you are privileged, but for some people, PAS will exacerbate oppression. One good resource for this is a paper called A Good Death, White Privilege and Public Opinion. And again, I don't have a quote from it, but basically it says that when opinions on assisted suicide are analyzed, they very often are the white position on that topic is presented as the normative position, and the opinions of people of color who tend to be opponents of the practice are sort of marginalized. And just another example of a privileged perspective on assisted suicide is a quote from an article called "A Designed Death: Where and When the World Allows It." And this was a recent article, and it says, for boomers used to planning and controlling many of life's choices, from when to have children to what kind of milk in their coffee, defining a good death seems like something they might want to discuss with their families and decide for themselves. And that's from A Designed Death: Where and When the World Allows It. I have no sympathy for this perspective because it's not necessarily linked to terminal illness, severe trauma, or suffering. You want a perfect death at disabled people's expense? I want a house next to the ocean in Fiji. The second part of the article has the author rationalizing her support for Canada's euthanasia program by asserting that track 2 for disabled people is only 1 to 2% of the MAiD deaths in that country. That is privilege. Only a few subjugated people are being killed by the policies that I am benefiting from. I'm going to skip this because, again, but this is a quote from a article by Carol Gill on how privilege operates in pro-MAiD advocacy, and she basically just says that the proponents are familiar with ideals such as independence, control, and freedom because they are, by and large, from the dominant sector of society. So this is a quote from, again, A Good Death: White Privilege and Public Opinion Research on Euthanasia. They say, in instances where the opinions of subordinate groups are made visible, those opinions are often treated as deviations from a white normative position. So I really think we need to talk about something called interdependence. The disabled community's conception of autonomy has a lot in common with the Latino culture. The disability justice movement emphasizes interdependence, autonomy with help, and autonomy experienced in relation to one's environment. The Latino and disabled communities' ideas about autonomy tend to emphasize making choices in consultation with one's community, your family, or your chosen family. The proponents' ideas about autonomy are based on the experiences of primarily upper middle class, able bodied people. And again, I would just say that as physician assisted suicide is a bastardization of autonomy. And again, I apologize, I forgot to describe the pictures on the last page. On the top, there is a picture of a disability rights protest in 1990. And at the bottom, there's a picture of people holding up a flag. Okay, so in respect to it being a bastardization of autonomy, I have a picture of a tweet that someone did. It says, "You can't send your kid to school with chicken pox or go barefoot in a restaurant. Your whole life has been a trade-off between public health and individual freedom." And that's basically what's going on here. We don't have assisted suicide in order to protect the human rights of subjugated individuals. So I will very briefly, I will summarize Paul Longmore's statement about disability justice and community justice and autonomy. He writes, some people with physical disabilities have been affirming the validity of values drawn from their own experience. These values are markedly different from and opposed to non-disabled majority values. They declare that they prize not self-sufficiency, but self-determination, not independence, but interdependence, not functional separateness, but personal connection, not physical autonomy, but human community. The affirmation of disabled values also leads to a broad-ranging critique of non-disabled values. The disability movement can offer a critique of the hyper-individualistic majority norms institutionalized in the medical model and at the heart of the contemporary American crisis. So the proponents' understanding of autonomy is not the only legitimate understanding of autonomy. Okay, so assisted suicide, this is part 5, assisted suicide, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and systemic ableism. So assisted suicide clearly violates the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, on the right, there is a picture of a cartoon designed by Amy Helsberg of Not Dead Yet Canada. It has a person in a wheelchair looking at a suicide prevention program, which has a flight of stairs. and then assisted suicide has a ramp and she can go right up there. So it's a good visual representation of the fact that suicide prevention is a public health service, and PAS undermines that service for people with disabilities. So I should say, and proponents will argue that disabled or terminally ill people have a right to waive their own rights, just like people can waive their Miranda rights. But those of us opposing it need to point out, but they do not have the right to waive those rights on behalf of disabled people as a group. They don't have the right to get rid of life affirming care or suicide prevention from disabled people as a group, just like nobody can waive, no one can get rid of Miranda rights just because they don't want them. So physician-assisted suicide may often function as an implement of systemic oppression. So the best representation of this is a Venn diagram that I have depicted on the right. It's got two circles. It has not disabled enough. Then below that, it has two disabled, and then in the middle it says right amount of disabled. Um, it says if you're not disabled enough, you'll be thrown off of benefits, you'll be die after being fit to work, there are no suitable or accessible jobs. If you are the right amount of disabled, you might inspire others and create what is called like inspiration porn. People will be inspired by you. But if you are too disabled, you won't get a ventilator. If you catch COVID, you'll be hurt by social care cuts, you'll be seen as a burden. And if that's really bad, there's always assisted dying. So it's not possible to separate PAS from the matrix of oppression that disabled people experience. Turning disabled people's suicides into a medical procedure is a kind of fourth class citizenship. Okay, so part 6, how does assisted suicide fit into the broader cultural milieu? Now, I'm going to try to go through this section quickly because it's a little bit of an aside, but I think that it's good for helping us understand more broadly why it's not good for the disabled community's political situation. So the disabled community is just very, very subjugated. For a good essay on this is Douglas C. Boughton's essay, Disability and Justification of Inequality in American History. And I have a picture of that on the right. On the left, I just have some examples of all the ways the disabled people are subjugated. Polling indicates that most people with disabilities believe that politicians from all over the political spectrum do not care about us. So there's a picture of that poll on the right, and also a picture of a tweet by someone who's discussing that issue more broadly. And I would say that people tolerating discussions about killing disabled people stem from that oppression in society. Briefly note, again, I'll go through this fast. PAS intersects with the failures of conservatism. Conservatives sometimes say terrible things about disabled people and support terrible policies. An example of this was a young man named Richard Hanania, who recently wrote an essay about how wonderful Canada's euthanasia program is because disabled people should kill themselves. He's also was found to be a white supremacist and was dismissed from his post. So that's just an example of a conservative person supporting PAS and harming disabled people. But also, physician-assisted suicide is sort of a failure of progressivism. So the mainstream left, or the able-bodied left, has a history of ignoring disabled people. So an example of this is that recently disability justice advocates had to fight for disabled people's issues to be included in health equity research. And the National Council on Minority Health and Health Disparities recommended against the move because it would take too much money and effort. So that's definitely, this was Biden's administration. That's definitely the progressives just sort of just ignoring disabled people. So in short, ableism is an equal opportunity offender. Nobody is immune. Here is another quote from a sociologist about how he didn't include disability in prior editions of a book that he wrote, and he regrets it now. So a lot of proponents just don't know any better. PAS just makes sense to a lot of people. And so I think Alan B. Johnson's statement on privilege is illustrative. Um, to summarize, the short version is oppression and dominance name social realities that we can participate in without being oppressive or dominating people. It's the same thing with assisted suicide and ableism. It might be nice to die with champagne in your hand, but the consequences of PAS aren't so nice for less privileged individuals. Other proponents just don't care. For some people, autonomy is a religion. So Thaddeus Mason Pope basically used the example, the same thing that Christopher Riddle said, that people die in car accidents all the time, but we have cars. And when called on that, I said to him, well, that acknowledges that some people will die in accidents related to assisted suicide, and he's determined to do it anyway. And he said, yes, just like we show advanced directives, surrogate decision makers, etc., and they have hours too. They have errors too. So basically, for some, and then on the right, I did want to read this quote by Jules Good, who is one of the policy analysts for Not Dead Yet. They write, biggest things I learned from talking to pro assisted suicide folks this week. We agree that the healthcare system is fucked. We agree people shouldn't be coerced for death. We disagree on the idea that it's okay for some marginalized people to die if it means others have a choice. And then they write, how can we ever achieve healthcare justice when most people think it's okay for us to be sacrificed? How can we build community with people who would gladly see us die against our will to protect their desire to die on their own terms? For some people, autonomy justifies disabled people dying. One thing I'll quickly go over is the not our problem advocate. So some proponents have begun to argue that there isn't a causal link between denial of treatment and legal assisted suicide, and therefore PAS is okay. That's a privileged argument. The opposition position isn't necessarily that assisted suicide caused the systemic problems. The point is that PAS exacerbates the problems. So the proponents are expressing apathy about how the privilege of getting to die with champagne in their hand might harm less privileged individuals. An example of exacerbating abuse, assisted suicide is basically putting a patina of niceness on sanism. In 2016, someone in a tabloid wrote an essay about it being good that a severely mentally ill person that she knew had drowned in a bathtub. This kind of attitude is called sanism, which is deep prejudice against people with mental illnesses. So members of the Right to Die lobby who are looking to legalize psychiatric euthanasia are making a good living turning this philosophy into a medical procedure. Another kind of abuse that will be exacerbated by MAiD is bullying. Disabled kids are often the targets of bullying. That includes other kids telling them to kill themselves. One thing I noticed is that the children's MAiD activity book on virtual hospice that validates Track 2 MAiD is basically the Canadian medical system doing that on a great grand scale. The book says some people might ask for MAiD if their illness or disability will not cause their body to die, but it causes too much pain or suffering for them to continue living with it, and there's no way to make the illness or disability get better or go away. So that basically tells disabled kids to be a corpse when they grow up, and kids will tell their disabled peers to kill themselves with MAiD. It's just what's going to happen. So on the right, there's a picture of that medical assistance in dying activity book. Another kind of abuse that's being exacerbated is clinicians demoralizing patients. So, as we know, a clinician wrote a case study about helping her anorexic patients kill themselves with MAiD. A really good article about this is called Terminal Anorexia, a dangerous justification for aid in dying. And basically, it points out that the study's author and a couple of other colleagues actually brought assisted suicide up as a quote unquote treatment option to these malnourished, vulnerable individuals. And that this is highly problematic and likely to be further demoralizing to the patient. And that's exactly right. Bringing that up when someone is trying to get treatment for an eating disorder is abusive. If assisted suicide laws had not been passed, the doctor would not have been able to suggest it to the patients and they would not have died. There's Another form of exacerbating abuse is physician-assisted suicide has been experienced as a kind of trauma by people in the disabled community. So I have some pictures of some of the tweets of disabled Canadians after the bill was passed. One young person tweeted, "Bill C7 is a nightmare. The devastating toll on the mental health of disabled Canadians cannot be understated. You're telling us we're better off dead, and so many disabled Canadians are taking that to heart and suffering more than ever." And then there are pictures of two other tweets that go into that same thing. So assisted suicide is a kind of social murder, especially when it's applied to someone who could live if they had treatment. Social murder is a term coined by Frederick Engels in 1945, and it's used, quote, used to describe murder committed by the political and social elite when they knowingly permit conditions to exist where the poorest and most vulnerable in society are deprived of the necessities of life and are placed in a position in which they cannot reasonably be expected to live and will inevitably meet an early and unnatural death. So you don't need to kill someone directly to play a role in their death. You can simply allow conditions that you know will put that person in a position to experience an early death. MAiD is a kind of coup de grace after a pattern of abuse. So part 7 is euthanasia in world history. So in ancient Greece, Plato in the Republic, I have a quote from there, basically says that we should put evil people to death and that we should also let disabled people kill themselves for their own accord. They should, because, quote, that seems to be the best for the ones who suffer such treatment and for the city. Plato was a great guy with some really good ideas, but he thought disabled people should kill themselves for the good of society, and that's what Canada is doing. There was some support for euthanasia in the progressive era. Now, not all 1920s progressive did harbor prejudice against disabled people. Some vocally opposed killing the disabled, but some people did support it because they thought it would achieve resource equity. And there's a quote about that issue from a scholar named Harold Braswell from a book called Keywords in Disability Studies that just documents that cultural event. So I would say sometimes physician assisted suicide is a consequence of lack of K through 12 training in disability history. I would say the best source historically that I know of to talk about the harms of assisted suicide is the Black Stork, Eugenics and the Death of Defective Babies in American Medicine and Motion Pictures since 1915. You see a lot of parallels. The book recounts a similar divide between progressive and conservative clergy on assisted suicide. Eugenicists presented their cause as being scientific and progressive and humane. Opponents were depicted as being religious and cruel. It shows a similar pattern of euthanasia proponents sort of simultaneously loving and hating people with disabilities. And also, there were legislative proposals to legalize euthanasia during that era, but none of them passed. So, more modern history is Compassionate Choices acknowledges that its precursor herb was the Hemlock Society. The Hemlock Society was founded by Derek Humphrey, and who did not limit himself to people with terminal illnesses. And I must say, Derek Humphrey wrote a blurb for Rethinking Life and Death, which is a book by Peter Singer. And in that book, Singer compares people with cognitive disabilities to chimpanzees, which is very hateful. So clearly, there's a link between some of the founders of this movement and harm to people with disabilities. Again, I wanted to talk about euthanasia and historical erasure. So disability history is not taught to children. This is something called historical erasure, which is when a culture oppresses a people group by erasing its history. One thing that Holocaust education doesn't usually cover is the T4 euthanasia program. On the right, there's a book called Forgotten Crimes, the Holocaust and People with Disabilities. And I am not saying that all MAiD is the same as the T4 program or that all the supporters are Nazis, but I do think there's a link between our culture not having discussions about the T4 euthanasia program during lessons about the Holocaust and people in our culture being willing to help disabled people die by suicide. Not teaching about the T4 program is part of the same package as sub-minimum wages, institutionalization, restraint and seclusion, etc. disabled people are being ignored and subjugated. So assisted suicide is part of a broader pattern of dehumanization and subjugation against disabled people. Um, and we don't need the Nazis to understand that. I'm going to skip it. Basically, there was a situation in Connecticut recently where a legislator who voted for assisted suicide accidentally quoted from Nietzsche's treatise about the importance of killing disabled people for the good of society while she was voting for disabled people. But she didn't realize that that's where the quote, "One should die proudly when it's no longer possible to live proudly," came from. So this person has a very good track record on other things that I could really get behind, like better education for disabled students and housing for people with severe mental illnesses. But she didn't have the historical knowledge to understand the link between what she was supporting and what she was citing. So one way you can help with this is promote efforts to teach disability history. There are organizations out there that are really leading the efforts to make disability history a regular part of K through 12 and college curriculums, and I strongly encourage you to get involved in those efforts. Okay, so just briefly, is it okay to mention the Nazis when discussing assisted suicide? I thought I should address this because I have heard it mentioned a couple times during hearings. Generally, the Nazis are not an effective USA assisted suicide argument. Um, Making a comparison to the between T4 and USAID makes PAS proponents seem paranoid. Most people would lack any historical context for the comparison. Hitler did not love the people that he killed, and the victims did not get to die on their own terms. So it's best to focus on how PAS furthers existing structures of privilege and subjugation. Reserve discussions about Nazis for broader discussions about the history of euthanasia, and do what you can to ensure that information about the T4 program is included in Holocaust education. And then there's just a quote. I'm going to skip this. A quote by a disability studies scholar about mentioning the Nazis. So instead of Nazis, stick to more subtle discussions of eugenics. So this is a piece, a quote from my colleague Joe Stromando, who is an ethicist who teaches in California. He says, while actions like these, by which he means forced sterilization, murder, or institutionalization, have become less common, the attitude that the existence of disabled people is a public burden and we ought to make efforts to remove them from public life remains exceedingly common. For example, while he was running for mayor of New York City, Andrew Yang suggested that unhoused people, disabled people, be institutionalized so they would not adversely impact tourism. Such comments must be understood in the historical context of the eugenics movement, which emphasized the ways in which the presence of certain undesirable people in the social milieu burdened or even directly harmed everyone else. So then he goes on to discuss how that even relates to killing disabled people. And as those who have studied utilitarian ethics knows, a utilitarian treatise waxing rhapsodically about, how we should redistribute the resources used for disabled people to do other things is very common, such as in the writings of Peter Singer. The proponents, if they don't want their cause linked to eugenics, then they really should stop platforming eugenicists. The Completed Life Initiative, Compassionate Choices, End of Life Choices New York have a partnership with each other. And CLI just featured a special lecture by Peter Singer, who supports assisted suicide, but in addition to that, has compared disabled people to chimpanzees, said that disabled people should be used in medical experiments, and has said that raping disabled people might be okay. In addition to that, Singer co-authored a paper called "Can Eugenics Be Defended?" And it basically says that yes, much of the utilitarian bioethics movement does support eugenics, and that's fine. Okay, so part 9 is connections between the USA and Canada. Okay, so Thaddeus Mason Pope would like to turn the US into Canada, and he is a Hastings Center Fellow. Pope appeared on Dr. Phil with Compassion Choices to promote conservative PAS. Stephanie Green, who is the head of Canada's euthanasia program, has given presentations at Harvard and Stanford medical schools. That's a tweet from her on the right, talking about how wonderful it is to go and learn with her US colleagues. Um, so clearly, it will seep over here if we don't do something about it. Another connection between the US and Canada is the Death with Dignity National Center is a member of the National World Federation of Right to Die Surprise Societies, and it is approvingly retweeted tweets from the Canadian accounts. And I must say, acting like killing disabled people is something polite people can agree to disagree about is abusive and ableist. The fact that they would retweet those tweets indicates that they either think that's fine or they just don't care. Okay. So the part 10 is the Canadian MAiD program and hatred of disabled people. So again, I'll try my best to move along. So bioethicist and disability studies scholar Harold Braswell wrote a Washington Post article called Canada is plunging toward a human rights disaster for disabled people. In an interview on the article, he notes, imagine if we stopped trying to prevent suicide among African Americans, women, or LGBT individuals. It would be viewed as an almost unimaginable form of bigotry, but this obvious bigotry goes unnoticed when leveled at disabled people. This is because while those other categories are largely viewed as social, disability is considered primarily medical. When disabled people suffer, this suffering is presumed to be inherent to their disability. And when it can't be cured, killing the disabled person seems like the only way to end their suffering. And then he just notes that what's happening in Canada is a cautionary tale for those of us living in the US. One that a contrast I wanted to point out is so on the right is a picture of a hate letter that was sent to an elderly woman in 2013. She had an autistic grandson. Um, it basically the letter said, among other things, it said, quote, do everyone in our community a huge favor and move. The moose, scram, move away and get out of this the neighborhood standing. Go live in a trailer in the woods with your animal kid. Nobody wants you living here. Do the right thing and move or euthanize him. Either way, we are all better off. Now, Gabrielle Peters, who is one of the leaders of opposing assisted suicide in Canada, notes a quote by a man named Dr. Derek Smith, who is on the Council of Dying with Dignity Canada. He said to a reporter, it says, quote, but Smith believes that the discussion should go even further to include young children. The committee isn't going to address that, but as a society, we should. For a 5-year-old, we should allow a substitute decision maker like the parent. So this man that Peters mentions is essentially advocating for the same thing that the author of the hate letter is calling for. The letter author calls for killing disabled children, and this man in Canada is calling for disabled children. Now, as USA assisted suicide is thankfully restricted to adults, but that doesn't mean we don't have people in the United States who would love to do that very thing. So assisted suicide can be viewed as a kind of systemic violence. No, so in 2016, a Japanese man named Satoshi Udasasu broke into a home for disabled people and murdered 19 residents. There's a picture of a memorial to the people who died on the right. And before now, to be fair, no one signed a consent form to be stabbed. No one got to die on their own terms. But before the man did it, he wrote a letter to Japan's government saying that disabled people were a burden on the state and, quote, I want Japan to be a country where the disabled can be euthanized. So the broader right to die movement employs that same rhetoric. Saying if you wear a diaper, it might be a good idea to kill yourself is pretty much the same message as Yuta Tsumatsu's. And killing disabled suicide victims with MAiD because they wear diapers is just basically a prettified version of what this man did. And the right to die movement's proposals about disabled people in general fit into a pattern of systemic violence against disabled people. One of the most disturbing things I saw recently was the Hastings Center celebrating post-suicide organ donations in Canada. In January of 2023, the Hastings Center tweeted out an essay celebrating the fact that disabled Canadians were donating their organs after they killed themselves. There's a picture of that tweet on the right. And in my opinion, this is hate speech. Organ donation after MAiD means that the organ donation people called up a suicidal person and asked for their organs instead of offering the person support to live. It means that someone who was thinking of killing themselves was further incentivized to do it by being told that doing that was a chance to help others. That system is bullying and cruel. Normalizing that system conditions disabled people to see themselves as organ farms, and normalizing that system falls into a pattern of systemic violence of disabled people more generally. Okay, so the United Nations has identified assisted suicide as undermining the human rights of people with disabilities. So I'll just briefly note. Okay, the experts said that even when access to medical assistance in dying is restricted to those at the end of life or with terminal illnesses, people with disabilities, older persons with disabilities may feel subtly pressured to end their lives prematurely. And there's a link to that statement and a link to a longer letter about it in that slide. Okay, so now we move on to assisted suicide, disability, and race. I must say, I am not as qualified to discuss this issue as my wonderful friend Anita Cameron, the Minority Outreach Director for Not Dead Yet, but I will do my best for a great discussion on race, disability justice, and assisted suicide. You can check out this video linked in my presentation featuring Anita and Keith Jones from Crip Hop Nation. So as you can see in this slide, a 2013 Pew poll found that the majority of BIPOC persons opposed assisted suicide. And also in 2012, it was found that the communities that voted for the initiative to legalize assisted suicide were predominantly white, and the communities that voted no were predominantly people of color. So again, there's just a long history of BIPOC individuals being oppressed by the medical system. A good book on that is Medical Apartheid by Harriet B. Johnson. It is true that BIPOC people have a hard time accessing all kinds of health services. It is true that most people who use assisted suicide are white and affluent, but a recent study of the Oregon law showed increasing usage among BIPOC individuals who have lower income who cited financial concerns. Okay, one thing to note is futile care laws and rates. So people may know about futile care laws in Texas and elsewhere where hospitals are allowed to force people off of wanted life-sustaining treatment. The majority of families who've had a loved one forced to discontinue treatment under Texas's futile care law have been low-income individuals of color. And if you look on the left, there is a picture of a tweet with Thaddeus Mason Pope, and he says that's statistically true. And then he goes on to say that correlation is not causation. He attributes that to African American, Hispanic people not trusting the medical field. But the point is, he's an expert. He agrees. People who are being subjected to futile care laws tend to be people of color. So an example of this is Tinsley Lewis and Emilio Gonzalez. Again, I'll try to go through this, but those were two examples of young parents with children of color who were bullied very often by predominantly white staff to withdraw treatment from a very sick child. And I think that if you accept the concept of a medical apartheid more generally, it seems illogical not to apply it to that kind of situation. So on the top, there's a picture of Emilio and his mom, and then on the bottom, there's a picture of Tinsley Lewis. Okay, so part 12, how does MAiD intersect with suicide? So MAiD is suicide. It's understandable that some people would draw a distinction between PAS for someone who was imminently dying and the suicide of a distraught teenager, but suicidal ideation is more subtle and complicated than that. And in the Netherlands, recipients of psychiatric euthanasia mirror the same gender-specific suicide patterns. Women are twice as likely to die by psychiatric euthanasia as men, and that mirrors the 2-to-1 suicide attempt pattern for men and women. So there's that. PAS is very clearly undermining suicide prevention in Canada. Canadians have been offered PAS in emergency rooms and on suicide hotlines. So on the right, there is a tweet by a woman who said, I volunteered for suicide prevention in Canada and was trained to offer MAiD to the users of the program. I no longer volunteer for that program. And then there's another tweet below that tweet that says, what the fuck? I tried to end my life, get sent to the hospital, tell them the pain I'm getting in is getting intolerable, and they ask if I thought of MAiD. That's some twisted shit. Don't take your own life. We want to do it. Fucked up world we live in. Okay. So, so I wanted to move on to the American Association of Suicidology's MAiD is not suicide statement. So in 2017, the AAS made a statement that, quote, aid in dying was not suicide. Tragically, that statement was used in the 2019 Canadian Trishan decision that expanded MAiD to Canadian disabled Canadians. That change was opposed by the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention, and the AAS retracted its statement about MAiD not being suicide in 2023. Unfortunately, the AAS's statement fit into a pattern of powerful people not fully thinking through how their policy positions impact people with disabilities. I think if they'd known more about the right to die movement in general, they might not have made that statement, but I don't think they knew. Unfortunately, research has shown that people are more likely to think suicide is acceptable if someone is disabled. So, a study named by Emily Lunn that was published in 2020 found that people were more likely to see suicide as acceptable if the person had a disability, and that remained true regardless of whether the person had a disability or not, and it remained true whether or not the person had a family member with disabilities. There's also some pretty significant problems that disabled people face in accessing suicide prevention. It can be very difficult to get admitted to an inpatient program. There aren't very many suicide prevention programs for disabled people. But here's another thing. So Thaddeus Mason Pope tweeted to me that it's good for people with disabilities to die by suicide. So the tweet was, I said to him, you run around all day screaming, it's good for people to die by suicide. It is, don't you think you're contributing to suicide contagion among people with disabilities? And he wrote, good for people with disabilities if they themselves determine that that is in their best interest. So I tweeted, so the suicides of people with disabilities are good. And he wrote back, yes, if that is what they want. So that's a pretty bold statement. And again, this is someone that Compassionate Choices sees fit to appear on TV with. I wanted to make a broader comment though about how to improve suicide prevention. I should note that sometimes suicide prevention morphs into behavior that is paternalistic and abusive. So please make sure that if you're fighting assisted suicide, make sure that you're not supporting policies like long-term involuntary hospitalization. That's why I have a picture on the right of the psychiatric survivors movement. Make sure you're listening to the concerns of disability rights advocates related to things like outpatient commitment, where people are ordered by a court to take medication. But obviously, compassionate suicide prevention based on love and respect saves lives. Creating a culture in which disabled people are subtly or explicitly encouraged to die by suicide is abusive and oppressive. One great model for assisted suicide that unfortunately no longer exists was the Live On project. It was a really great project where people with disabilities wrote essays and made videos about overcoming suicidal ideation. But it was unfortunately the funding for the project was cut. But you can watch some of the videos that were made for the project at the YouTube link linked in this slide. So now I'm going to talk about my friend Amy. So Amy is a good Canadian friend with PTSD and severe chronic pain. And like many disabled Canadians living with suicidal ideation, Amy was simultaneously offended by the Canadian government's decision to offer PAS to disabled people, and was tempted to apply for it because the offer of suicide was staring Amy in the face. Amy reached out to me and another Twitter user for help after Amy was told to die by PAS on a suicide hotline. So on the right, I have a conversation with Amy with her, identifying information blacked out. And she was told by this person she was talking to on the suicide hotline, well, MAiD is a legit and legal option. Maybe it's something you should consider. The healthcare system seems to be failing you, and you're never going to get the opioids you think you need. Um, and she wrote, gee, thanks for reminding me. I guess I should give up then. So Amy was told she couldn't have any opioids for her severe chronic pain, and she was also turned down by two clinics that specialized in treating chronic pain. And this caused Amy to relive the abuse that had caused the PTSD, and it made PAS seem attractive. Amy didn't want to die by PAS, but Amy said that her government's PAS program was like, quote, a monkey on my back, telling her to die. Um, Amy did not want to hear your body, your choice. Amy said that she needed someone to tell her unequivocally not to kill herself. So when we were talking, she wrote, MAiD has made everything so difficult, hasn't it? That's kind of rhetorical. Some things like life is always worth fighting for should be black and white subject. But when someone now has the legal right to assisted suicide, there's so much bloody gray. I long for the black and white to return so I no longer have to live in the gray. So Amy needed the message that PAS was bad. So that's what we did. We told Amy that assisted suicide was bad and Amy should not do it, just like suicide prevention hotlines are supposed to do. So for months, we talked to Amy pretty much every day. Whenever Amy thought about dying by MAiD or some other way, we talked Amy down. We essentially took the place of the suicide hotline that had told Amy to die by suicide. The three of us became really good friends. We talked about our childhoods, our religious beliefs, our similar experiences with unremitting health problems, the ableism we had experienced, and our hopes for the future. I must say there was one night where I felt very afraid that Amy was going to apply for PAS that night, or Amy was going to kill herself some other way. For example, she wrote, "No relief tonight, no relief ever. If there's an alternative to MAiD anywhere for me, I don't see it, and I'm too tired to look. Uh, I refuse to hope anymore. It hurts too much. I'm not saying I'm giving up tonight, but I'm saying I might. I'm sorry." Um, we managed to help Amy regain the will to live, but it felt like a close call. I would never tell anybody who Amy is, but I called my therapist for advice at 1 in the morning. Talking about great leaders who had experienced suicidal ideation helped Amy. By working with other disability rights activists and the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, we were able to get Amy some assisted devices to make living with her physical disabilities more manageable. Amy mustered the courage and financial support to take a train 4 hours away from home and show up at the emergency room of a hospital that specialized in treating chronic pain and mental health. Amy finally received excellent care. Amy says that she still experiences chronic pain and PTSD, but that the pain is manageable. She is not planning to die by PAS. The Canadian system would have killed Amy before giving her the treatment that she needed. Peer support was critical for Amy. All three of us Twitter friends had various disabilities, and we had all experienced mental illness. Because the other two of us had been through so much with our own mental health and disabilities, we were able to have insight into what Amy was experiencing. We were able to tell Amy about our own experiences with the dysfunctional medical system, our painful and ineffective search for treatments, and our recoveries. Without that mutual experience of disability, it probably would have been harder to connect with and encourage Amy. It was my very deep honor to be one of the people to help Amy. So here's my conclusion. How can we promote disability justice instead of assisted suicide? I think we need to kind of create chosen family. Now, on the right, there is a picture of my brother and his wife and my nephew. There's a picture of me and my cousin standing by a lake. There's a picture of me and my parents after they adopted me as a baby. And there's a picture of me and Anita Cameron and Tom Harkin at an adapt action. Um, so my family was there for me when things were really tough. Um, Family can be a really important tool for helping disabled people circumvent oppression, but not everyone has a family. So, very often, people in disenfranchised communities band together to form families of people with similar experiences. And so, I think we have to be each other's family when we can. We're all going to have limitations on what we can reasonably do for someone else. But I think if our culture treated treated each individual like they were part of a human family, then it will be harder for people to make utilitarian value judgments about disabled people's lives. The solution two is put disabled people first. Um, everybody in our society needs to be fighting for disability rights with no other personal political agenda. And you especially need to be doing this if you're working with the disabled community to oppose assisted suicide. Disabled people face very severe oppression that would exist even if there was no PAS. So make sure you're calling attention to the depression and try to fix it. Examine your political narratives for ableism. Support a strong social safety net for disabled people who cannot work, and fight for things like good educational opportunities and good jobs for disabled people. And fight against things like institutionalization and some minimum wages. So we need a kind of disability rights new deal, a package of laws that would radically transform the political landscape for people with disabilities, both here and in Canada and other countries. Now, I want to make sure I describe the pictures. On the top, to the left, there's a picture of three Black women hanging out with each other. One is in a wheelchair, one is using a cane. They're watching a video on their iPhone. And at the bottom, there's a picture of an ADAPT protest with a bunch of people, rallying for disability rights taken in 1990. All right, so and then there's here is a slide with some other resources where you can find reporting on Canada's euthanasia system that is quite good. There's a link to a music video satirizing Canada's MAiD program. And there's a link to some academic research on the use of Canadian MAiD as a substitute for disability supports. So that is it.
Well, thank you, Megan. I'm very pleased to see that we also have Anita Cameron with us on this Zoom event. So that's very, very good.
Thank you. And I'm really glad to be here. And I was a little late, but this is amazing. Thank you so much. I wanted you, Megan, if you could, to further explain the concept of white privilege.
Sure.
Because
sure.
I saw something in the comments that disturbed me.
Okay.
So if you can do a good explanation of that, that would be great.
Sure. Okay. So white privilege basically means that historically BIPOC individuals have been subjugated. And that means that the perspectives, the needs, the concerns, the culture of European Americans descending who are white tend to predominate. And that means that the systems of society are set up in a way that sort of naturally disadvantage people of color. That's what leads to things like the medical apartheid that was discussed in the in one of the slides. So definitely one of the best ways of doing this is to think about intersectionality. And my relationship with Anita has been very helpful in that regard, considering the fact that people with disabilities or people of color may have specific needs and experiences that intersect with systemic racism. And again, I really do think that this work on assisted suicide, where people of different political perspectives come together to really oppose it, I hope that it may be an opportunity for people with who really kind of know about systemic racism, like Anita, to really educate people who may be less familiar with the concept and maybe really have some thoughtful discussions about race and disability.
What I want to emphasize when people say white privilege, it's not talking about your wealth or anything like that. It's talking about the advantages that you have that are connected to your race. We're not saying that white people are never oppressed. That's not true. If you're white and disabled, trust me, you're going to suffer oppression. If you're white and LGBTQ, you will suffer oppression. What it is that you're not dealing with oppression because of the color of your skin.
Yeah, exactly. And you put it so much better than I could. I mean, I do my best, but I mean, you're such a wonderful speaker. Thank you for contributing, clarifying that.
Thank you very much for presenting this. One of the things I have been very much following these issues in Canada. So I'm in Cesspool Central, Ottawa, and I remember they had presentations when they were initially fighting this. So is it not true that the vast majority of those that are disabled, whether mentally or physically, they would say they have a fulfilling life, they have meaning, and they feel they contribute to society? Why aren't their voices, like, isn't there the majority in your
Right.
research? And why isn't that that I think should be pushed from our perspective?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of reasons that one of the I didn't get to read the quote from Beth Haller's essay on disability and the media and how that relates to representations of a disability. But she notes that this trope of focusing on the few people with disabilities that want to die is very common in the media, and that the perspectives of disabled people who want to live, disabled people who oppose it, are not centered. And so that's, I mean, the media clearly engages in a lot of advocacy for this policy, and so they decenter um the disability rights voice against assisted suicide. It's a form of oppression. I mean, disabled people are silenced in many ways in society, and this is just another one of those things. There are all sorts of different ways that people with disabilities are represented positively, but our society regrettably seems to want to have its cake and eat it too. As a in that regard, it's like, I want to say that disabled people are empowered, but also I want the right to kill myself if I'm disabled. Um, so I think those are some of the factors that are contributing to that situation.
When we were going in Canada with that, when we were experiencing that Carter court case, in British Columbia, there was a group of people with disabilities who formed and intervened in the case. And if you looked at it, you would have noticed that this organization didn't exist before this. They were represented by the same lawyers who were connected to the pro-death court
Yeah,
case, and they just formed in order to have an opposition to the disability people who were opposed, who actually were the Council of Canadians with Disabilities and the major groups, etc., in order
right.
to have the opposite voice recognized in the court.
Well,
That's the kind of thing.
that's what is being done. It's called tokenism. When you take a few people from a disenfranchised group and you put them out in front, and you say, "Oh, well, they really represent the real disability rights representative." It's tokenism. It's like the Gerber baby. I said this earlier in the presentation. That's what's being done in the United States too. They form little groups of the supporters, and they say they're a disability rights group, and then they sort of die, and they're all generally connected to the death with dignity movement. Whereas, groups like CASH, groups like the Disability Rights Education Defense groups, groups like the ARC, these are groups that have existed since the 1970s and have dedicated their entire lives to advocating for people with disabilities. So the media and the death with dignity movement likes to engage in tokenism, but that is not the general perspective of the disabled community at all.
So Jean's been asking about organizations to support. Now she's in Ontario, because of course there are certain I would say organizations that are not good for supporting because they don't share her
Sure.
perspective on
Well,
euthanasia.
there are lots of I know Inclusion Canada has been very vocal. They're an advocacy for the rights of people with intellectual disabilities. Definitely a good organization to support. There's an organization called BCANS, um, and that is an organization that's centered on promoting the human rights of Indigenous persons with disabilities in Canada. They're a really great organization to support. If you look in the link, and I'll send this out by email, I have a link to a letter that was signed by every disability rights group in Canada opposing the bill. And so those groups could probably really benefit from your support.
Absolutely. Are there any other hands going up? Anything else in the chat? Stephanie has her hand up again. So Stephanie, we'll let you complete that. And then after Megan answers a question, we can say thank you very much and goodbye to everyone. Stephanie?
I just wanted to add, like, this is all, you know, like research is changing all the time. And it's just with, when you're dealing with anorexia and different disordered eating, like you are dealing, they've connected it with mental health. So again, you're dealing with people who cannot fully, intellectually make decisions again, so you could add that in. There's so much research that just does not support. There is no informed consent. There
Well,
isn't really,
it's
I
really
would say.
Well, it's complicated. So people, and I can say this from personal experience as someone who's lived with an eating disorder and does stuff with mental illness rights. People with mental illness and eating disorder should have some autonomy and retain some decision making capacity. But something like should you eat or not clearly is impaired by the disorder itself. I mean, again, I really go back to that issue of the scientific research indicating that someone with a psychiatric disorder who's having symptoms is often functioning like a person who's functionally drunk. And that's what I would say it feels like. For a lot of people, psychiatric euthanasia, offering it to them is going to be like asking a drunk person if they would like to have sex. You can get a yes out of the person, but it's not very meaningful and it's abusive.
Yes. That's what and like their ability to really make decisions when it concerns life or death are definitely inhibited. So
yeah.
Well, thank you, Megan. Do you have any parting comments?
Oh, thank you for this opportunity. I hope that it was helpful to everyone. Feel free to get in touch with me if I can clarify anything. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Alex.
You're welcome. Anybody who sends me an email, I'll forward it to you.
Awesome. Thank you.